Today, we're talking to Marc Lesser. He is a Zen teacher, a trainer, and a CEO who has worked with organizations around the world to marry mindfulness and leadership. Today, we're talking about his book, Finding Clarity, where he teaches us about his concept of compassionate accountability. This is about being clear and direct, but also being kind and connected. This results in strong, high-performing teams, something we can all benefit more from. Let's get into it. Welcome to The Conscious Entrepreneur, the only podcast 100% dedicated to the well-being of entrepreneurs. It's where founders come to sharpen their edge from the inside out and lead with clarity, connection, and purpose, without buying into hustle culture or burning out. Hit subscribe right now so you never miss an episode. Let's get started. Marc, in your new book, Finding Clarity, you talk about compassionate accountability. Could we start by having you kind of share your definition of this great concept?
It's interesting. The word language is so interesting because, whatever words we use bring up images and meaning and history for people. I think for a lot of people, accountability might sound a little harsh, actually. I've been gravitating more and more toward the word alignment. Like because in some way, what accountability really comes down to, I think, is aligning around what does success look like.
Expectation setting.
Yeah, expectation setting, or maybe even broader than that, vision setting, right? Like what are we actually trying to accomplish? What does success look like and not look like? And in some way that sounds so obvious, but it's interesting how often that isn't done in relationships in general, not in and out of the business world. I think most even friendships or romantic relationships go off the rails when there aren't those conversations and adjustments about, alignment. And then, right. So that's the accountability part of the phrase, compassionate accountability. And compassion can maybe often sound too soft for the business world, right?
Yes, it's a marrying of the harsh and the gentle here, I'm hearing.
That's right. And it is, right? So the compassion part is the human part, the sensitive part, the caring part, the building trust part. And I think all relationships, but especially I think here I'm using the phrase in relation to building healthy cultures within any kind of organization, small, medium, large, for-profit, there's always a culture. There's always what are the norms? What does it feel like? How safe is it? Are people working energetically? Are people working together? And to me, these two, alignment, accountability, are ways of building energy, building a sense, right? A sense of doing things that are important, making progress, things that we can measure. Often in that realm of accountability and alignment, we can measure financial success. We can measure, how people are performing. And the compassion side is harder to measure, but just as easy for people to feel. Right? We feel. Does it feel good to work here? Do I feel good when I come into work? And do I like working with this team, either as a leader or as a member of a team? How does this is there a sense of trust? Do we and in some way, I think a lot of it comes down to care. Do I really care about the work that I'm doing and the people that I'm working with? And Yeah, so there's a certain, I think, important energy in these two, putting these concepts in one, right? Compassionate accountability, or, you know, uh, alignment with caring. However, whatever language works for you.
If there's a way to have more clarity in a relationship by both being aligned around expectations and then being able to have an honest and direct and compassionate conversation around those expectations and where gaps may be, or where there are things to celebrate, that's kind of the ideal thing we're working towards. Mark, why did you feel that this idea of finding clarity and compassionate accountability needed its own book?
I think it just comes up over and over and over again in when I think of the companies that I've run, and now in the companies that I get to coach or consult with. It's just such it it it's a container that a lot can go in. Uh, you know, even like individual well-being. How do you practice and think of individual? How do you bring more, right, self-compassion and a sense of self, alignment, aligning with my own goals, with my business goals, and um, yeah, there's a certain um, ring of, and also not to get too hung up or caught by you know, the conflict, or the paradoxical nature of it, right? That you know, and I think to make it, I think it's important that it's not about finding the midway point between like compassion and accountability. No, it's like high compassion, high accountability, both. How do you do both? And to bring that to the forefront of one's awareness, and to make adjustments as necessary.
What do you think are some of the biggest misconceptions about finding um, this duality of high compassion and high accountability? What do you think maybe gets in the way of people wanting to show up that way? Is it fear?
Yeah, fear, or as I said earlier, I think we all bring our own narratives and ideas to these things. I you know I I was once pitching a program to a big pharmaceutical company around mindfulness and emotional intelligence, and I met with the head of learning, and he says to me, well. We really are embracing mindfulness, but we're really not that interested, in emotional intelligence. But why don't you talk to my partner down the hall? And I go down the hall, and his partner says, we really embrace emotional intelligence, but we're not so interested in mindfulness. And it made me realize just the power of language and the narratives. And to me, like, well, what is emotional intelligence? And what is mindfulness? And what is leadership? And in some way, there's a tremendous amount of overlap between these three big concepts, these three big buckets. The work, I often call my work, mindfulness based emotional intelligence, right? An integration of these things. Yeah. So I think it's easy to get hung up on whatever, narrative and history we might have around this language. And to me, it's important to just to be more curious about, okay, what are we really talking about when we talk about, right, compassion and accountability? In what way might those be useful? I think of um, a a leader that I was coaching not that long ago, who was a really, really strong, a strong leader, but often crossed the line between, when he thought he was inquiring about from his team was experiencing him as interrogating, right? That there was his holding people accountable was not perceived as compassionate at all. In fact, the opposite. And and it was hard, as often is, hard for people on the team to give him that feedback. How do you say that? How do you say that to your manager who can fire you? Or so there's I think that's there are hierarchy and power relationships in the business world that makes these concepts, these practices, I think, challenging, but more and more important.
It's really interesting to me because I think in my own personal development, I can relate to being perceived more harshly than I intended to be perceived, and feeling that, sort of this accountability was, um, my responsibility as a manager, and the way that you made sure that everyone was doing what they were supposed to be doing. And I viewed it less as a way to support my team and more as a way to control or get compliance.
Right. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. So, I mean, that's
I think I was a less mature manager at that time. But I think it's a common
every,
problem.
every leader has to contend with even, right. How do you give people enough space and room, right? You want to be spacious. You want to, we all want to be treated, with a sense of trust and spaciousness and, not micro, right? So so the shadow sides, one shadow side is micromanaging or kind of micromanaging or a kind of harshness. But then there's a shadow side of not being clear enough about what you expect. And how you are perceived is going to be different, by different people. Um, I sometimes, I've noticed in my last CEO role, there were some people on my team, people who were on my leadership team, who thought I was, making decisions too quickly and not including enough people. And there were other people who thought I was too slow, that I was taking too much time and including too many people. So or even, it's funny. It's so interesting, but how to work with people's different understandings, expectations, narratives. But to me, you know, the way to cut through it all is around, being as clear, and vulnerable, and a kind of vulnerability, to be open about, to actually even talk about these things.
I think one of the things I've learned through this podcast and talking to so many thought leaders is the relationship between effective leadership and vulnerability, and your willingness to say, this is what I'm trying to accomplish. These are my goals. I may not always hit the nail on the head, but I aspire to marry these concepts, right? I want to be clear. I want to be supportive. I want to be empathetic and compassionate. And I want to take action to make sure we are all doing the things that we've agreed we are going to do together. And I think that's really the main concept that you're sharing in this book is, how do we get closer to that? And you have some advice for leaders, right? So certainly this notion of setting the tone with your team and expressing your desire to accomplish this maybe is a great first start. What comes after? What comes after that conversation then?
I think it's ongoing conversations, and again, it's how to build enough trust that people can that you can talk more openly about these things. And this was, one of the findings of this famous study that Google did, called Google Aristotle, in which they wanted to know, right, what was it that separated great teams, and they really, and it's interesting how I applaud their approach was very data driven, and trying to really put aside preconceptions and do long-term study and data collection. And they were surprised. Google was surprised at, this is where I think the phrase, psychological safety first really emerged, was because that was their finding. The number one thing that separated really, really high performing, measurably high performing teams was that people felt safe. And then, well, how did that happen? What are the practices? And it was the ability to admit mistakes, the ability to be more real, to be more human, to create more trust.
In the Google study, when they were talking about psychological safety and the teams that were the highest performers having a high perception of their psychological safety, did they have any conclusions about what the leaders were doing in practice that was creating more of that atmosphere?
Yes. I mean, I think it was, admitting mistakes, admitting, again, a kind of different forms of vulnerability. Leaders, right? They were more real, and creating an atmosphere where people felt that they could express their doubts and ask questions, not be not be concerned about appearing as incompetent, or we're I think this is the um, you know I sometimes call it the dirty little secret of the business world, is that we're all human. And not only are we all human, but we all have very tender hearts, really. And we all have, our identities of, am I competent? Am I a good person? Am I lovable? Uh, you know, um, yeah, and we're, and in some way we are, you know, we're hardwired to scan for threats, right? Right. From an evolutionary perspective, we've evolved to need to stay alive. And how do you stay alive? Well, you're looking for, from an evolutionary perspective, fear and scanning for threats are valuable and important. Um, and they may be important as someone growing a business, right? Looking for threats, being aware of the competition. Uh, and all of that is useful and important, but it needs to be, I think, tempered by an awareness of that we're also hardwired for compassion and connection and care. I think it's shining the light. It's shining the light on fears and doubts and scanning for threats, and shining the light on compassion and trust as well, and bringing it in as health as a way of creating healthier relationships and cultures.
And I think the reason that we're talking about this today in this podcast is because, our listeners value the humanity of business. And we are trying to do things differently than maybe the norm that exists today. But the reality is, the reason that businesses like Google study these things, and in fact, you were a teacher of mindfulness at Google and did some really interesting work at Google. Part of the reason they studied this and worked so hard on it is because it does impact business results. It creates better business outcomes. And so if you're looking for a reason beyond just the humanity of, being a conscious leader, this is also good for the bottom line, and it's useful.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think, many companies get there's a lot of evidence and studies of the relationship between, emotional intelligence and business success, right? The emotional intelligence are a set of competencies, things like communication skills, things like, self-awareness, things like how we work with how we work with anger and difficult emotions. Those, if we're not competent in those things, it's going to be hard to be successful. There's a lot of correlation between emotional intelligence and business success. And more recently, well, how do you actually move the needle on these emotional intelligence competencies? Well, things like psychological safety, vulnerability, mindfulness, and meditation are all ways of enabling people to build those emotional intelligence skills and competencies.
And you have a workbook that accompanies your book, Finding Clarity, that talks about 7 particularly important practices that help create more clarity. I'd love for you to share, if you would, a little bit about those practices. And I know we don't have time to go into great depth about each one, but maybe you could walk us through those.
Sure. Well, it's interesting. I like something about 7, the 7 habits of effective people was still a great book. I wrote a book called 7 Practices of a Mindful Leader. It was kind of an accident that this turned out to be seven practices, but
An
these
auspicious number for you, maybe.
these 7 practices are: be curious, not furious; drop the story; listen for understanding; mind the gaps; cultivate a clear vision; turn breakdowns into breakthroughs; and the 7th is don't wait. Um, and I think in some way, we've been maybe touching on, especially drop the story. Drop the story is a lot about, the ideas we have about compassion or accountability, and I think even just realizing that we can't help it, but we see ourselves and the world through story, through narrative, and that we can, how do we bring awareness to our, maybe habit energy, the stories that maybe restrict us or constrict us, the stories that get in the way. And and, and I think a good part of leadership is and this is the practice of, cultivating a clear vision, right? Which is how to support people to rally around the story of success, the story of meeting the needs of our customers and growing our company. And I think of, there's the above the line story about our financial goals and what we're wanting to accomplish, and the below the line vision of what's the culture we want to create, right? How are we working together? What are the norms of that? So yeah, um, I think there's so much in any of these 7 practices, right? You know, I think, in today's world, man, there's a tremendous amount of, we're living at a time of great uncertainty and change. It's easy to wake up and read the newspaper and be furious. So like the first practice, right? Be curious, not furious, right? Uh, yeah, important and easier said than done, right?
Oh, all of this is, simple ideas, but not easy to execute.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
Turning breakdowns into breakthroughs is a curious one of these practices. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting, even I mentioned earlier in our conversation the example of the leader who had a way of interrogating people and didn't realize it, and was a lot of people, people wanted. He didn't realize, the fact that people didn't want to be on his team, and the fact that he wasn't being promoted to, um, and a lot of it had to do with his lack of. So there was a breakdown there of a lack of awareness on his part, behavior that he was engaged in that was kind of pretty toxic. And once we shed light onto that, and he got it, and realized, oh, I need, he didn't realize how he was being perceived. And that led to a breakthrough where he kind of was able to make some shifts and be, still aligning around his. It's okay to have high expectations, but how do you have high expectations and use that as a way of connecting and building trust, and not beating people over the head and making them feel like crap because they're somehow putting them on the spot in a way that makes them feel incompetent, right? So he realized, his own breakthrough was that he had this thing about competence and incompetence, and he was always beating himself up constantly about, like, this idea that he might be seen as incompetent was causing him to run an awful lot of unnecessary stress and anxiety. And I think a lot of us do that. I do that at times, right? I'll notice my own fears around, oh, am I competent enough, as a coach, as a lead, whatever it is. And those are, you know, um, it's not that it can be healthy when those come up in ways that are supportive and bringing more awareness and light to how we're working, and not, a lot of leaders have this, I think, almost unconscious belief that they have to be hard on yourself in order to get things done, and, and hard on the team, right? Yeah. So an interesting experiment that I often suggest is, for the next week, try being kind to yourself. Just try it and see, are you getting less done, the same amount, or more? And it's often quite a breakthrough of seeing, oh, you can uh, you can have high expectations and be kind to yourself both. You don't have to be hard on yourself and hard on others.
It's interesting. Our episode of the podcast that I recently recorded was about self-compassion and self-talk. And it's a really interesting dovetail into this conversation, because this idea of being more compassionate, even in the face of having high expectations, is so pervasive and impactful, both internally facing as well as with our teams. And I think if you're a leader or a people manager, culture creator, and you're interested in kind of becoming more aware of how you're showing up or the culture that exists in your company, what advice would you give for somebody who's saying, like, I'm listening to this podcast and I'm recognizing that this is maybe a growth area for myself or other managers within my organization? How can they put this new awareness to work, and maybe use this book, use the workbook to make some changes? Where would they start?
Well, I think these days, working with a coach can be great, uh, or even just experiment with having some conversations, like ongoing conversations I like to have with people I work with is, you know, what can I do better to help our team be more effective? Like you could actually have those conversations with people. Possibly you could try that. Um, this is where, again, my own bias and my own experience is having a meditation practice, having a practice where you can become more familiar with your own self-talk, your own creating a little more space in you know your own stories and narrative can be helpful. Um, Yeah, this is I'm also part of a few different groups. Like I'm in a group that started many years ago, back when I was CEO of my last company, a group of CEOs that's kind of almost like a feedback group where we're giving each other, where I can present issues and challenges that I'm having and get feedback from my peers. So some kind of peer circle, some kind of community. Yeah, journal writing, actually, a tried and true many CEOs uh, very committed to, the artist's way of the morning daily writing practice. It can be, yeah. I think it's all the different forms, I think, of self-awareness um, and getting feedback and community building.
Mm. Well, I think what I am hearing you say is, starting with just even the curiosity of, what is going on in my own mind? What am I saying to myself? What stories am I telling?
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I feel
So
like,
much starts there, right?
yeah, uh, I feel like I learned so much I spent several years working in a Zen monastery kitchen, where very high pressure, high expectations. We were, during the summer, this Zen monastery turned into a conference center. So we were making gourmet vegetarian meals for, 80 or 90 people, three meals a day, and, 15 people working together, in a hot summer kitchen with knives in our hands, with very high expectations. And it was one of the most beautiful, satisfying experiences about seeing working together and this strange combination of uh, high expectations producing great outcomes, three times a day, uh, and working hard, and yet there was such a sense of love and practice and connection in it, and I was like, wow, why? Maybe there's a way to bring the spirit of that kind of working together into other workplaces, and yeah, that continues to be that's my life's work. And I feel like it's if we're going to change the world in our, whether it's our families, our communities, our businesses, or and beyond, it's uh, yeah, creating a sense of again, maybe it's a compassionate accountability, uh, real deep trust and connection and freedom, along with the energy of getting stuff done, getting good stuff done.
What a beautiful way of sharing that story. Thank you for sharing that. And I'm wondering if maybe there's a shift on prioritization that people who value this goal that you've shared, and I do too, is to think about maybe making it equally important, that it feels good, and that is as important as that we accomplish a high objective.
Well, I think we've kind of said it in a few different ways. We accomplish more, and we accomplish more of the things that really matter when we care, when we're when we're fully aligned and committed and caring, and and a group of people working together who care. This is, again, I think of, the civil rights movement, or the movements that uh, and the movements that are needed, around climate change and sustainability and women's rights. Like, man,
So many important issues. Yes.
there's a lot of big issues, but and then but on the ground, in whatever business, whether you're running a business or on a team, um, yeah, the sense of bringing in more a sense of joy and humanity and compassion while you're getting stuff done, and to see that it doesn't take away from getting stuff done. It will amplify whatever you're trying to accomplish.
What an impactful shift. Um, could you share maybe one daily habit that you think a culture creator, a leader, an entrepreneur could introduce into their own practice that would help move them towards this?
Sure. And an assignment I gave to a leader I was working with yesterday was, I think of these as maybe 4 practices for developing, clear thinking. And the one is to ask, am I sure? Am I sure about whatever story I'm telling? Am I sure? The second practice is to ask, what am I actually doing? Just to be curious, what am I doing? What am I doing? Often when there's any conflict, we're looking at what are other people doing, but what am I doing? The third practice is hello habit energy, like to be aware of my habits, my patterns that are maybe not serving me, to bring awareness to that. So I like this language comes from the Vietnamese Zen teacher Thich Nhat Hanh. He recommends the practice, hello habit energy. It gives a little bit of humor to it. And the fourth practice is the practice of love, to remember that love has a place in our work and in our lives and in all of our relationships. So these kind of four simple daily practices around developing maybe clearer thinking.
Mm. Thank you. If people are interested in your book and in learning more about you, and maybe even, actively learning more about coaching their teams or coaching themselves through this way of thinking, could you share some resources that you have to offer about that?
Yeah, I have a lot of about me. My website is marclesser.net, marclesser.net. I've written 5 books. Finding Clarity is my 5th book. 7 Practices of a Mindful Leader is my 4th. Come check it out.
There is a lot there. There are some great resources here. And I really appreciate this conversation and encouragement. Again, this is something that we, as mindful humans and conscious leaders, value, and a reminder to shift our priorities if they're falling out of alignment. I think this is a great reminder. So thank you, Marc, for the conversation today. Very valuable.
Thanks, Sarah. And maybe I'm I'm a quote collector, and the quote that is reverberating for me today is from the teacher Choyam Trungpa, who says, the bad news is that life is like jumping out of an airplane without a parachute. The good news is there's no ground. So I think I'm turning that it's, I think, a way of working with uncertainty, which we all could use some more help with, I think.
Beautiful. Marc, thank you so much.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks for watching The Conscious Entrepreneur. If something landed for you, will you leave a comment? I'd love to hear what you thought. And if you haven't done it yet, hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode. Thanks so much, and I'll meet you here next week.